before war, before kingdoms, before history itself had a voice, there was hunger and fear. In the beginning, survival wasn't about courage. It was about distance, the distance between the hunter and the hunted, between the living and the dead. The first humans were small in a world built for giants. Teeth, claws, muscle, everywhere but on us. Our only weapon was our mind, and even that in those early days was still learning to be sharp. They called nothing tools, because names hadn't yet been born. They called nothing weapons, because the concept of power was as new as the morning light. The world before invention, picture it. The air thick with heat, the smell of wild grass and blood, the low growl of something hidden just beyond sight. You are alone. You have a stone in your hand, blunt, chipped, useless from a distance. You throw it. It falls short. You run. This was life before the string. Every hunt meant a risk. Every meal was bought with danger. A single misstep meant becoming prey. And yet, humanity endured. Because even when our bodies failed us, our curiosity did not. In every broken bone, in every scar, there was a lesson. In every loss, a spark. And somewhere in that spark an idea began to form. Not a word, not yet. Just a whisper. There must be another way. The fire inside. To truly understand the man who invented the bow, you have to understand the silence that came before him. The silence of starvation, of failed hunts, of watching the strong survive while the weak vanished. He was no hero, no genius, just a man who refused to die without trying something new. Maybe it started by accident, a branch bending under pressure, snapping back and flinging a seed across the dirt. He noticed. He always noticed. That small act of nature became a question. What if I could control that? He didn't yet know tension, or energy, or trajectory. But he knew the feeling of potential, that invisible force hiding in a curve, waiting to be released. The same feeling we now call invention, the spark of observation. Every great creation starts with a small defiance. While others hunted, he watched. While others fought, he listened. To the wind, to the sound of branches, to the rhythm of flight in the birds above him. He began to see patterns. When a branch bends, it wants to return. When it returns, it carries power. When that power is directed, something moves. He tied sinew between two pieces of wood, testing, failing, breaking. Each failure left bruises on his hands, but not on his resolve. There was no audience, no witness, only the whisper of wind and the crack of tension. And then, one day, it worked. The moment the world changed. The first arrow was no masterpiece. It was crude, uneven, splintered, a rock tied to a reed. But when he pulled the string, something ancient shifted. The branch bent. The sinew groaned. The world held its breath. And then, release. The arrow flew, a line of motion faster than sound, sharper than thought. It struck the bark of a tree, a dull thud, then silence. He stared. He walked forward, touched the mark, a wound in the wood that no hand had made. He laughed, or maybe he cried. It's hard to tell the difference when the future arrives all at once. When distance became power. That moment, the arrow in the tree, was the first time distance became safety. No longer did he have to approach the beast. He could strike from afar. He could choose when danger began. The world's oldest rule had been broken. Until then, every predator had to face its prey. Now, for the first time, a creature could kill without being seen. The invention of the bow was the invention of asymmetry, of imbalance between life and death. And with it came something darker, the idea of control. The reaction. When he returned to his tribe, they didn't understand what they were seeing. He showed them a stick, a string, a stone. He bent it, pulled it, released. The arrow vanished into the air. The others gasped. Some laughed. Some called it magic. Some called it madness. But when the first deer fell, when the first hunt ended without a scratch, the laughter stopped. They gathered around him, touching the bow like it was alive, and in a way, it was. The first machine, the first tool that stored energy and waited for command, a bridge between thought and force, the birth of wonder and fear in every tribe, every story. Power divides. Some see a miracle, others see a threat. The bow gave food, but it also gave power to one man's hands. He could hunt alone. He could defend himself. He could decide who lived and who didn't. And in that realization, the tribe felt something new, fear of their own kind. Because before the bow, violence was strength against strength. Now it was speed against time. One motion, and the world changed forever. He had made a god's gesture, and no one, not even he, understood the cost. A tool becomes a symbol. That night, as firelight flickered against the cave walls, they gathered around the hunter. The bow rested beside him, wood gleaming like polished bone. The elders stared. Children whispered. Someone asked, "What do you call it?" He looked down at his creation. He didn't know. It wasn't just a weapon. It was an extension of will. He lifted it slowly. Bowed wood, taut string. A shape that looked like tension made visible. "Friend," he said softly. Maybe meaning the bow. Maybe meaning death. The first lesson. To truly understand invention, you must understand its twin. Consequence. For the man who made the bow, victory came with silence. The hunts grew easier. The tribe grew stronger. But something was lost. The intimacy of struggle, the respect for danger, the rhythm between predator and prey. Now, death came too easily, too quietly, too cleanly. He would stare at the fallen animals, feeling both triumph and guilt, because he knew each kill was no longer a fight, it was a decision. The bow didn't just pierce flesh, it pierced meaning. The shadow of thought invention is never pure. It always carries a shadow. The man began to dream of arrows, flying endlessly, piercing the night, hitting targets he couldn't see. He woke in sweat, hands trembling. Because somewhere deep inside, he understood, what can protect can also destroy. The same distance that gave him power could one day separate him from empathy. And that is how humanity changes, not in one grand act, but in a single moment of convenience. The first doubt. The bow had fed them, it had saved them, but the tribe began to depend on it too much. The old ways, traps, teamwork, patience, faded. They no longer chased together. They no longer shared the danger. Now, one man could hunt for 10. And in that abundance they forgot the hunger that had once united them. He saw it happen. He saw pride replace gratitude. He saw greed bloom like rot. And though he didn't have the words, he felt the truth that still haunts us today. Every invention eventually rewrites its creator. The whisper of legacy. As he aged, he tried to teach caution. Respect the bow, he told them. It listens. But no one listens to a warning born from wisdom. They only listen to results. And the results were undeniable. More food, more safety, more life. He watched the children train, their small fingers learning the motion he had discovered. Pull, hold, release. They laughed when the arrows flew. He did not. Because he knew that sound, that soft twang, was the beginning of something the world couldn't unlearn. The end of the beginning. One day, as dusk settled over the valley, he sat alone by the fire. The bow lay beside him, its string humming softly in the wind. He thought of the first time, the trembling hands, the sound of wood bending, the flight of the arrow. And he wondered, had he created life, or simply learned how to end it more efficiently? He smiled, because deep down he knew the answer didn't matter. What mattered was the act itself, the defiance of weakness, the triumph of thought. He closed his eyes. The fire crackled. The world kept spinning. The bow would outlive him. It would outlive his tribe. It would outlive everything he had ever known. And that was the price of being first. The first arrow changed everything. But not all change feels like progress. Sometimes it feels like prophecy. The bow had been born from survival, a bridge between thought and motion, between fear and control. But now, that bridge led somewhere darker, somewhere human hands were never meant to reach, because once power could travel through air, so could ambition. The first flight. It began innocently. Practice, play, curiosity. Children copied the hunter's movements. Men competed for distance. Women crafted smoother arrows, straighter shafts. And then one day, someone pointed the bow not at an animal, but at another man. It wasn't out of hatred. It was demonstration. A joke. The arrow flew. A scream followed. And silence, thicker than smoke, filled the air. They buried the man quietly. No songs. No words. Because the tribe had learned something new. The line between tool and weapon is drawn in blood. The weight of creation. He didn't speak for days. The man who had made the bow, the one they now called Maker, sat alone, staring at his hands. The same hands that had once trembled with joy now trembled with shame. He had wanted to save lives. Now his invention had taken one, but even as he mourned, others practiced, perfected, improved. They bound stronger strings, sharpened harder stones, hunted faster, and with every improvement the bow became less his creation and more theirs. He realized something terrible. Once an idea escapes, it never belongs to its maker again. The whisper of power. At night around the fires, stories began. They spoke of men who could strike from unseen distances, of arrows that flew like the breath of spirits, of hunters who never missed. Fear and fascination grew together, like twin vines wrapping around the same tree. The bow was no longer a tool, it was a status. The strong held spears, the wise held bows, and slowly, quietly, the balance of power began to shift. The first battle. It started over something small, a river, a boundary, a deer that wandered where it shouldn't. Two tribes met. Words turned to shouts, shouts turned to stones. Then, from a hilltop, a single arrow flew. One man fell, and before his body touched the earth, the world had changed again. The first arrow ever used in war wasn't carved with hatred, it was carved with fear. Fear that the other side might strike first, and once the first shot was fired, no one could remember who they were before it. The age of distance. To truly understand what followed, you must imagine how new it all was. Before the bow, conflict meant closeness. You saw the whites of their eyes, you felt the heat of their breath, but now, death came from nowhere, fast, silent, invisible. The bow had turned courage into calculation. It had replaced struggle with strategy, and humanity had crossed another invisible line, from surviving the world to shaping it. The Maker's warning, he tried to stop them. He spoke to the elders, to the hunters, to anyone who would listen. "This is not how we were meant to fight," he said. But no one heard him over the sound of string and flight. The tribe had found comfort in distance. They no longer risked their lives to take others. They no longer feared what they couldn't touch. But he did, because he saw what they couldn't. That distance kills empathy. The farther the arrow flies, the less the shooter feels, the birth of the archer. Over time, the bow changed even the people who used it. Their arms grew lean, their eyes sharpened, their minds became patient. They learned to breathe with rhythm, to hold still as the world moved around them. to become one with the string. The archer was born, the first human who could wait, who could think in silence, who could turn control into art. And yet, for all that grace, every shot still whispered the same word: power. The shadow in the forest. Rumours spread. Stories of a man who could kill from the trees, of arrows that fell like rain. Other tribes began to fear the forest itself, because it could watch, it could strike. And the maker, now old, realized his invention had given birth to ghosts. The bow had erased the boundary between presence and absence, between being there and being deadly. For the first time, violence no longer needed confrontation. It needed only direction. The silent revolution. As years passed, tribes adapted. Those who had bows survived. Those who didn't disappeared. Entire generations grew up never knowing life without string and arrow. Children learned to aim before they learned to speak clearly. The maker's name was forgotten. But his design, his shape, remained in every hand that pulled back a string. And perhaps that's the cruelest truth about genius. It rarely survives as a person, only as a pattern. The fire and the feast, one evening the tribe celebrated. They had won a battle, not for land, not for survival, but for pride. The fire blazed high. Laughter filled the air. The boughs rested beside them, polished, honoured. The maker sat apart, watching the flames dance. To them, it was victory. To him, it was prophecy. He looked at the fire, at the sparks flying upward, and thought of arrows, hundreds of them, rising into the sky, falling upon people he would never meet. He whispered softly, "Fire and string, they both burn." The legacy of control. When the young came to him for advice, he didn't speak of power. He spoke of balance. "The bow listens," he said. "It remembers." They didn't understand. How could they? They had grown up in its shadow. To them, it was as natural as breath. He told them, "When you pull the string, you bend more than wood." "You bend the world itself." They laughed. And why wouldn't they? The world was bending for them, not against. The first imitators. As the bow spread, it evolved. Different lands gave it new forms. Short bows for forests, long bows for plains, composite bows for conquest. Every version carried his original thought: power can travel. But each new improvement pulled it further from its origin. What began as a lifeline became an empire's backbone, and in every iteration a little more of his soul was lost. The night of the storm, one night, the maker dreamt of arrows raining from the sky. He saw fire spreading across the valleys. He saw cities, things that did not yet exist, burning. He woke with tears in his eyes. He didn't know it, but he had seen the future. A future where his simple bow would echo through centuries as thunder, as cannon, as bullet, as bomb. Every pull of a trigger, every command from afar would trace its lineage back to a man trying to eat without dying. The last arrow. In his final days he returned to the forest where it had begun. He made one last bow, small, imperfect, fragile. He tied the string himself. His hands shook. He drew it once more, aiming not at a beast, not at a man, but at the sky. The arrow flew. It vanished into the clouds, and for a brief moment he smiled. Because even though he could not control where it landed, he had learned to let go. And maybe that was the final lesson. Creation is not ownership. It is surrender. The beginning of forever. The forest grew quiet again. Wind moved through the trees, soft, rhythmic, like a bow being drawn by the earth itself. The maker was gone. But his mark remained. In every weapon, in every invention, in every act where thought meets consequence. The bow had become more than a tool. It had become a story, one that every generation would rewrite again and again without ever knowing who told it first. Because progress has no author. only echoes. And the first arrow, the one that started it all, still flies somewhere unseen, unstopped, carrying the weight of every invention that followed. The bow had given humans distance, but distance, once discovered, asks for more. What began as a line between life and death soon became a gulf between the powerful and the powerless. The first arrow may have been carved from hunger, but its descendants were carved from ambition. And as the string tightened across generations, so did the grip of those who learned to use it best. The rise of the hunter kings. In every tribe there comes a moment when someone decides to keep what was meant to be shared. The bow made that easy. Whoever held it ruled. No longer did age or strength matter. A youth with steady hands could fell a leader with a whisper. Those who mastered the bow became protectors, then providers, then rulers. They stood apart from the rest, eyes sharp, hands steady, hearts cold. People began to call them something new, not hunters, not warriors, but archers. The archer was no longer just a man. He was a symbol of reach, of precision, of quiet control. The first kingdoms of fear. Villages began to gather under the banners of those who could defend them, and inevitably those same bows that defended would begin to conquer. A tribe with 10 bows could defeat one with none. The bow was not strength, it was leverage, and leverage built kingdoms. Walls rose, laws followed, power solidified in the hands of a few. The string became the first border, the arrow the first law. And the man who once invented it to survive would not have recognized the world it created. Because now humanity no longer feared the beasts of the wild, it feared itself. The architects of distance. To truly understand how power changed shape, look at how the bow transformed the mind. It trained people to think in lines, not just of flight, but of consequence. The archer had to imagine the path before the arrow existed. He had to calculate, predict, anticipate. That kind of thinking was the seed of strategy, of leadership, of politics. The bow built the first planners, the first tacticians, the first kings who ruled from afar, and from that moment onward, power no longer needed presence, it only needed aim. The birth of war. The first wars were small, clashes of tribes, arguments over hunting grounds. But the bow turned conflict into ritual. It allowed armies to fight without touching, to kill without seeing faces, and as arrows darkened the sky, so did the hearts of those who fired them. War became less about survival and more about demonstration. Who could shoot farther? Who could strike faster? Who could control fear itself? The bow was no longer a tool of need. It was a test of dominance. The song of the string. Every invention has a sound. The wheel hums, the hammer clangs, the bow, it sings. That soft hum before the release became a song of both creation and destruction. Villages learned to listen for it. That high, taut whisper that meant death was near. Children grew up fearing the sound, and those who wielded it began to crave it. Because control can become addiction, and the bow, for all its elegance, was pure control. Pull, hold, release. Life gone in silence. The Maker's Shadow. His story was now myth, a nameless man who had stolen the secret of the gods. Some called him a prophet, others a curse. In some tribes they painted his image on cave walls, a man holding lightning bound in wood. In others they spoke his name only as warning, but everywhere his creation endured. Because you can destroy a man, but you can't destroy what he taught the world to imagine. The first laws of power. As kingdoms grew, so did the need to justify power. Only the chosen may wield the bow, said one ruler. The gods decide whose hands are steady. Control became divine right. Violence became sacred duty. The bow, once a symbol of innovation, became a badge of class. And so the distance between hunter and prey turned into the distance between ruler and ruled. The farther one could shoot, the farther he was from consequence. The price of perfection. To perfect the bow was to perfect death. They experimented. Bone instead of wood, horn instead of sinew, fire-hardened arrows that flew straighter, faster. Each improvement felt like progress. Each progress a step away from humanity. Because every new invention is a mirror, and the bow showed mankind its coldest reflection. We did not stop to ask if we should shoot, only how to shoot better. The Archer's Oath legends tell of an ancient brotherhood, men who dedicated their lives to the art of the bow. They trained in silence, ate little, spoke less. To them, the bow was not a weapon, it was a prayer. They believed every shot carried a piece of their soul, and so they shot only when necessary. But history forgets restraint faster than it forgets blood. Soon their discipline became militarized, their patience weaponized. The oath of balance became the doctrine of war, the first rebellion. For every ruler with a bow, there were 10 who feared him. The unarmed began to rise. They stole strings, bent their own branches, crude, clumsy, desperate, but effective, because power, once seen, cannot be unseen, and control, once hoarded, cannot last. The bow that once united tribes now divided them, and the maker's dream of safety had become the world's first arms race. When the sky fell. No one knows which battle was the first great slaughter, only that it began at dawn and ended when the sun disappeared behind smoke. Arrows rained down like storms. They filled the air with whispers, each whisper a life ending before its time. When it was over, the ground was a field of feathers and ash. The victors cheered, the survivors wept, the dead said nothing. But if they could have spoken, they might have said, "This is the sound of progress." The curse of distance. To truly understand the tragedy of invention, you must look at its silence. The bow silenced the intimacy of struggle. It taught humans how to kill without feeling, and once you can do that, you can do anything. Empires began to rise on that silence. It became the foundation of civilization, the ability to act without empathy, to build without looking down. The arrow, once meant to feed, now fed ambition. And from that ambition came cities, thrones, dynasties, each built on the same invisible principle, control from a distance. The maker's dream revisited. If he could have seen it, would he have wept? Or would he have understood? Because maybe creation was never meant to be kind. Maybe it was meant to be inevitable. The bow was not evil, it was reflection. It did not corrupt, it revealed. It showed what we were capable of once fear no longer stopped us. The seeds of tomorrow. Centuries passed. The bow became history, then legend, then myth. But its lessons remained in our bones. Every tool since has carried its echo, the pull, the aim, the release. The spear became the bullet, the arrow became the missile, and humanity continued to stretch that distance inch by inch until war became mathematics. And all of it began with one man, one branch, and one moment of wonder. The quiet. Between storms. By the end of his life, the maker's name was gone, but his story remained in whispers. Some said he ascended into the sky to watch his arrows from the stars. Others said he was buried with his bow so no one could steal it again. But the truth is simpler. He never left. He exists in every decision we make to choose control over compassion, efficiency over empathy, distance over connection. The bow is not history, it's inheritance. The lesson of the string. The bow taught humanity one great paradox, that power and vulnerability are made from the same materials, a branch, a string, and the hands that pull them apart. The farther we draw the string, the greater the force, but also the greater the tension, and someday, when we draw too far, the string will break. That is the shadow of power. It does not end with the first arrow, it only waits for the next. The The bow began as survival, then it became power, and now it was destiny. It carved its way across continents, across generations, across every line between necessity and desire. Wherever humans went, the bow followed, like shadow to flame, like consequence to creation, and in its flight, civilization itself began to take shape, the first armies. Once, men fought in small groups, a dozen hunters, a circle of shields. Now, there were hundreds, then thousands. The bow demanded formation, ranks, rhythm, unity. It turned chaos into choreography. Arrows needed space to fly, commands needed silence to be heard, and so, from its string, the first armies were drawn. What began as hunting became organized death. Each arrow was no longer a man's choice, it was an order, and with that humanity learned obedience. The Empire of the Sky. In the valleys of the Nile, under the gaze of forgotten gods, archers rode in chariots of wood and bronze. Their arrows fell upon enemies long before swords could clash. Pharaohs carved their victories into stone. Figures with drawn bows, knees bent, arms outstretched, eyes steady. To them the bow was not a tool, it was divine will. The god's hand, they called it, the power to strike without being touched. Across the deserts and plains, empires learned the same lesson, that whoever commands the air commands the earth. And in that race for reach, the world became smaller. The silence before victory. To truly understand the bow's dominion, you have to hear what battle became. No roaring beasts, no crashing swords, just the hum of strings, thousands of them. The air filled with that trembling sound, an orchestra of tension and release. Then came the storm. Arrows black as night, raining like judgment. When the rain stopped, the ground glittered with the fragments of feathers and bone. The survivors looked upward, not in anger, but in awe, because for the first time death had become abstract, impersonal, unseen, inevitable. The bow and the throne empires rose on the bow's back. Kings ruled through distance. They no longer needed to fight. They only needed to command those who could. The archer became both warrior and servant, the arm of the ruler, the invisible executioner. And yet, beneath the triumph, there was always unease. Every arrow that flew for a king was still born from a man's hand, a hand that trembled, that questioned, that remembered hunger. The bow connected rulers and killers through one fragile line of string, a reminder that power, no matter how distant, is still human. The Mongol win centuries later, on the endless steppe, a new kind of mastery was born. They rode like thunder, horses and bows, speed and distance in perfect union. The Mongols changed the world's geometry. They turned the bow into movement, war into wind. Their arrows flew farther, hit harder, and carried whispers of conquest from China to Europe. Cities burned before they even saw their attackers. Empires crumbled before they understood what had struck them. And through it all, the bow sang its ageless song of precision, of patience, of inevitability. The maker's ghost rode with them, because his idea had finally achieved what all ideas crave, perfection. The poets of war. But it wasn't all blood. The bow inspired art, music, poetry. In Japan, the bow became meditation, kyūdō. Each shot a spiritual act. The target, not an enemy, but oneself. In Greece, archers were mythic. Apollo with his golden bow, Artemis, the huntress of moonlight. In India, the Dhanush was divine, the weapon of gods and heroes. Even in the West, bards sang of a longbowman whose arrows fell like rain. The bow had transcended the battlefield. It had entered the human soul, because in its arc we saw ourselves, fragile, striving, caught forever, between tension and release. The fall of the masters. But all reigns end. Steel replaced wood, gunpowder replaced sinew. The bow's voice grew quiet. It lingered in the hands of hunters, in the rituals of monks, in the games of princes, but its empire had fallen. Still, even as muskets thundered, kings kept their archers in paintings, their bows gilded in gold, symbols of a purer age. Because the bow, unlike the gun, required something divine, skill, discipline, patience. It demanded partnership between body and mind. It was, in its way, an instrument of respect. And when it left the battlefield, the world lost a little grace. The forgotten craftsman. The bowyers, the makers, were the quiet magicians of history. They shaped wood into potential. They bent it until it almost broke, then taught it to sing. They worked in silence, smelling of resin and sweat, their hands lined with stories. Each bow was unique, like a fingerprint, like a prayer, and though kings and warriors took the glory, it was these humble artisans who kept the maker's spirit alive. Because in every curve of their craft was the same truth he had discovered, that creation is born from tension. The philosopher's arrow. By the time cities grew from stone to marble, thinkers began to question the cost of progress. What did the bow teach us? To survive or to dominate? One philosopher wrote, "Man's first weapon was his first mirror." Another said, "The bow did not invent violence, it refined it." The irony was clear. The tool that gave us distance also gave us reflection. Through it, we began to understand not only how to kill, but what it meant to do so. The bow had become philosophy in motion, every arrow, a question about who we are. The empire within. As war faded and time marched forward, the bow found new meaning. Archery became ceremony, sport, discipline. But something lingered, a quiet remembrance of its origin. Every archer still feels it, that ancient heartbeat when the string tightens and the world holds still. In that moment they touch the same silence the maker once knew, the silence before creation, before consequence. It's not just aim they feel, it's memory, the memory of what it means to hold power and choose when to let it go. The last empire. There came a time when even empires forgot how they began. Swords rusted, bows cracked, libraries turned to dust. But deep beneath it all, in the rhythm of progress, the pattern remained. The bow had taught us how to store force, how to direct energy, how to send will through air and time. That knowledge never died. It evolved. Every machine, every weapon, every device that flings energy forward carries the spirit of that first bow. The maker's string became the chain of civilization, the monument of air. No monument stands for him. No stone bears his name. But look closer. You'll see his legacy everywhere. In the curve of a bridge, in the arc of a cathedral, in the shape of a satellite's orbit. The same geometry that bent the first bow still shapes the world today. His invention was not wood or string. It was the idea that tension creates motion, and motion creates history. The return of the string centuries later, we rediscovered the bow, not as a weapon but as remembrance. Archery schools reopened, craftsmen relearned the old ways, movies, myths, and games revived the sound of the string. Because something in us still craves that feeling, of control and surrender, of patience and release. Perhaps we never truly wanted to kill from afar. Perhaps we only wanted to remember what it feels like to be human, to stand between fear and courage, with one heartbeat left before the shot, the lesson of empires. All empires fall, but ideas do not. The bow's empire ended, but its philosophy remains. That strength lies not in force, but in the space between wood and string, between thought and action, between creator and consequence. That is where the human story lives, in the tension that never ends. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we still draw the string today. Not to kill, not to win, but to remember.